Hello and welcome to our review video on unit number 3, which is Change of Empire. So this is where Great Britain begins to take control of the colony in North America. So there's a lot for us to look at in this video. I know the video is long, but that's just because I tried to go through everything at a decent pace and trying to build connections between one concept and the other. So please don't be overwhelmed by the length of the video. It's pretty comprehensive and it should help you for the exam. Let's get started. Okay, so our Unit 3 Change of Empire unit, we're going to be looking at a number of different things. To start off, I think we're going to look at the reasons for the conflict, which took place between France and Great Britain, and how that led to the 7 Years' War. Once the 7 Years' War takes place and comes to an end, we have the signing of the Treaty of Paris, and the signing of the Treaty of Paris leads to a number of different changes, territorially as well as politically, and then you have the official signing or announcement of Royal Proclamation in 1763. While all of that is happening, you begin to have grumblings or unhappiness throughout the British colony. So you get the Quebec Act being signed in 1774, which has repercussions because it creates a bit of tension, specifically down in the 13 colonies who are not happy with the signing of that act. And that leads to the American Revolution, which ultimately leads to the creation of a new country of the United States of America, which has certain effects on population because you have a group called the Loyalists who then have to migrate up to Canada. We're going to look through all of these right now, so let's get started. So to begin, let's look at the reasons for conflict. So basically the wars were taking place between Great Britain and France all throughout the 17th and the 18th centuries, okay? So that's the 16 and 1700s. So they actually clashed primarily in Europe, right? You had Great Britain versus France actually going to war back in Europe because each wanted to sort of overthrow the other one with the goal of increasing its power all throughout Europe. However, it wasn't really long before all of this conflict spread its way across the ocean and into the colonies in North America, which had actually become a major issue in their sort of battle for power. There were two reasons why these confrontations led to battle, and the first one is that each of the two colonial powers wanted to dominate the fur trade. For example, the Hudson Bay Company, which was an English chartered company, competed against the French, who also were in the Hudson Bay region. Okay, so you have control of the fur trade. The second reason is because of territorial expansion. New France found itself sort of boxed in by the British around the Hudson Bay, which was to the north, and then they also found themselves sort of boxed in by the 13 colonies who had controlled the eastern part of the colonies. So the 13 colonies were actually restricted by the French, who controlled most of the Great Lakes territory all the way down through Louisiana, and yet the 13 colonies had rapidly grown their population and they needed more space to expand, so they were in conflict with France. So I'm going to show you a map just to give you a better understanding of the state of the conflict at that time. Okay, so if you just have a quick look here, this is to give you a better understanding of what was going on. So when I said that the French were sort of boxed in the north, what I mean to say by that is if you look at the Hudson Bay area right here, the red indicates that that's where the British were dominant. And so all along the Hudson Bay you can see British dominance right there, and that had to do with the fur trade. Meanwhile, if you look to the south, or the eastern part, right here, these were the 13 colonies, and that was also British, as can be seen because it's red. So you have British occupying here, and meanwhile in the middle from the Ohio Valley, from the Great Lakes region, which is right here, all the way down to Louisiana along the Mississippi and the Ohio River, all here you have French. So basically what you have now is you've got the British attacking the French from the east, and now you have from the north coming down. So there's your conflict. All right, so the Seven Years' War is a really important time during the change of empire, where the control of the colony moved from France over to Britain, and the 7 Years' War started in 1756. It actually started a couple years earlier in the colonies, but made its way over to Europe by 1756, and this ended up being really the last war between Britain and France for the control of the colonies. France got beat pretty handily. Okay, so in order to really show why France lost the 7 Years' War, I'm going to do a comparison chart because I think it speaks a lot to the reasons why they lost, okay? Number one, if we just do a very simple comparison between the number of soldiers that had actually fought during the 7 Years' War, this is what you had. So there were only 7,000 soldiers in the colony on this side of the world for France versus 23,000 for Great Britain. So Great Britain had a much larger military in the battle for North America. If we talked about the number of warships that were sent over, only 38 warships were sent by France. Compare that, sorry, I'll use red. Compare that to 116 for Great Britain. So they had a much larger warship or naval force. And then finally, if you look at the budget in British pounds, okay, France only really spent about £5 million on the war effort in North America, whereas the British spent upwards of £80 million. So just in terms of resources, it's really, really straightforward that France didn't devote anywhere near the same amount as North America. At this point, you probably want to ask yourself the question right now of why, right? You might say, well, why? Why did France? And it's actually really simple. During the battle for North America, France didn't have anywhere near as much interest in developing the colony, or protecting it, I should say, because they really felt that they needed to devote way more of their attention to their actual mother country. They thought that the dominant or the power that could be gained by controlling North America really wasn't all that great. So much of their focus was just on winning the war in Europe. They really thought that the colonies were not all that important. Conversely, Great Britain felt the opposite. They thought they knew that the resources, or the control of the resources in the New World, was really central to becoming a dominant force in Europe. And so they said, if we can win the battles taking place in North America, we're that much closer to A, achieving our goal of becoming a much more larger empire, and B, expanding our territory. So really what you began to see now is actually early on in the 7 Years' War, really the first 2 years, the French actually did a pretty good job when it came to winning battles. They were victorious in a number of different areas, and interestingly, it wasn't until around 1758, when Britain captured Louisbourg, that they really began to sort of dominate the 7 Years' War. By 1759, Quebec City was under attack by the British naval fleet, and that's where the Battle of the Plains of Abraham took place. So this was a victory for the British. They captured Quebec City, and with that, you began to see the French surrender by 1760, and so Quebec City was now British dominated. During this time, there was a rule called British rule. And this was when the British military, was actually in control of that territory. So it wasn't the actual government of Britain that had conquered Quebec City, but rather just their military. And so that was called British rule. It wasn't actually until the end of the 7 Years' War in Europe in 1763 that New France was now completely turned over to Britain. Okay, so once the 7 Years' War came to an end, and obviously Britain won, the Treaty of Paris gets signed in 1763. Okay, so the European powers come together and they sign the Treaty of Paris, which basically officially ended the war. And this is a war that had been very, very expensive for Great Britain, but the British were now in possession of such a vast territory in North America. So the Treaty of Paris brings about some major territorial changes that altered the borders of the empires in North America, which I'll show you right now. Okay, so now as you can see, things look a little bit different. So basically, all the red is now British possession. So after the 7 Years' War, you can see the vast territory of land, right? I mean, just to give you some reference, here's the Great Lakes, right? Here's the St. Lawrence Valley and the St. Lawrence River, and now you can see that Britain literally owns such a vast territory of land, all the way from the Hudson's Bay Company, literally all the way down into Florida. It gets cut off at the Mississippi River. This is all owned by Spain, which France had ceded to Spain in 1772. But now you can see that Britain has a tremendous amount of territory. Really, the only land that was ceded to France at this time is the Miquelon Island and St. Pierre Island, which can be located right up there and there. So really, at this point, the signing of the Treaty of Paris really grants Britain all that land. So some of the effects of that could be felt, namely the fact now that the French-speaking, the Canadiens became British subjects. So the Canadiens are now British subjects. Which had very, very damaging effects for them. Their French culture, their Catholic religion, and things like that were now beginning to be affected. In addition, you begin to see Aboriginal peoples have a difficult time after the Treaty of Paris, because they had good relations with the French, but now that they had been conquered by the British, their interests were in question, and so at that time you began to see a lot of tension between Aboriginals and the British. In fact, there was so much that there began to become a rumor that the French were looking to recapture Quebec City, and so a gentleman by the name of Chief Pontiac, an Aboriginal peoples person, decided to go into a coalition with the French to go against the British. However, with the signing of the Treaty of Paris, that coalition really weakened, and then Pontiac officially signed a peace treaty with Britain by 1766. At this time, you really began to see the British people begin to assimilate, or implement assimilation. They wanted French people to adopt, or I should say Canadian people to adopt British ways of life. And one of the ways they did this was with the first constitution that they would draft, and that was with the signing of the Royal Proclamation. So in 1763, with Royal Proclamation, you now began to see a number of things take place. One was another change to the borders. So now you had the province of Quebec, which was very, very small. I'll show you an image of it right now. So if you take a look here, here's the province of Quebec, right? And so there it is. But what you got to notice is that it's actually British owned. So you can see how much smaller it was if you did a compare. If you go back and watch and rewind a few minutes, you'll be able to see the change in the province of Quebec. It's still called the province of Quebec at this point, but it's so much smaller than it once was, and that's because of the signing of the first constitution, which is the Royal Proclamation. There were some other things that the Royal Proclamation did, like it established a new political structure where the province of Quebec now had a governor-general that had absolute power over everything else. Society was really changed as well, because now you began to see Canadiens being assimilated. They wanted to make the province of Quebec like its other colonies in North America, so the governor of the province of Quebec, a man known as James Murray, received instructions that specified that he place in order sort of strategies for Canadiens to now adopt English language, their religion, as well as British culture. So he imposed what was called the Test Act. I'll just write that. So the Test Act was implemented, and the Test Act was anybody who wanted to hold office or become a part of the British administration had to take an oath that they would now renounce their Catholic faith and that they would become authority to the Pope. They also had to refrain from any new Catholic priest in the colony. They had to create a Protestant school. It favored British immigration, and it distributed land in the form of townships rather than seigneuries. All that being said, Royal Proclamation, once again, did three things, okay? Reduced French culture, and the three ways were through language, right? Less people were allowed to speak French. The Catholic faith was reduced, and just in general way of life. Okay? So that's what Royal Proclamation did. In addition, what Royal Proclamation did is it kind of gave Canadiens sort of an ultimatum. they had to decide, were they going to stay or were they going to leave? In many cases, French soldiers, as well as other colonists, returned back to France because they didn't want to stay. And so population, became a point of contention. And finally, just one last thing. When I talk about way of life, you now began to see French criminal law and civil law be replaced by the British laws. Okay, so French civil and criminal laws were replaced. Okay, it's worth noting here that at that time there began to be a little bit of conflict or unrest in the 13 colonies, and it had certain consequences. So at the end of the 18th century, the British government feared that the 13 colonies would demand greater independence, and what they ended up doing, though, one of the major issues that was going on at that time, is that when Royal Proclamation got put in, the British government realized that there was a certain amount of debt that had occurred because of the 7 Years' War, and so the British Crown maintained that the 13 colonies living down south should actually have to pay some of that debt from the war, since they were the main beneficiaries, or they benefited the most from Britain conquering New France. So Great Britain thus imposed new taxes on various imported products, which included things like sugar, and this policy really provoked a strong negative reaction from the 13 colonies, specifically from people like merchants who felt that they were being negatively affected by it, okay? So basically, one part of the colony's population maintained that the mother country should not be imposing this tax on the 13 colonies without granting them some type of representation in government. This is the whole idea of taxation without representation, because you have to think at that time the 13 colonies weren't allowed to be in the British government, yet they were being told they had to pay a mandatory tax for a debt that was accumulated. So they felt it was really, really unfair. So the whole no taxation without representation principle began to be shown forward. So in the years that followed, the British government continued to impose new laws and new taxes, and to show their dissatisfaction or how upset they were, the colonists down in the 13 colonies issued certain reports and dispatched ambassadors to Great Britain to boycott certain British manufactured goods. This is, of course, known as the Boston Tea Party, which happened in 1773. So there was this thing called the Tea Act, which colonists disguised as when colonists disguised themselves as Aboriginal people, and they threw the tea cargo of 3 British ships into the Boston overboard. This event, called the Boston Tea Party, caused the British authorities to close the Boston harbor until the cargo's value was fully repaid. All that being said, all you have to know is that taxation without representation meant that you couldn't charge people tax in the 13 colonies because they weren't really allowed to be represented in government, and that tax money didn't really benefit them. It just didn't benefit them, okay? So that was the whole issue going on in the 13 colonies, which is really important as we move forward because we're getting closer and closer to the American Revolution. Okay, so in 1774, the Quebec Act occurs. The governor at that time was Governor Carleton, so no longer Murray, but Governor Carleton. He was after him, and he was really, really concerned that all of that sort of unrest going on in the 13 colonies would actually have an impact on the province of Quebec. He believed that the more and more the 13 colonies started questioning taxation and whatnot, he feared that the Canadiens who were living in Quebec somehow might actually join the 13 colonies in their sort of rebellion or revolt. So fearing them rebelling, they decided that they would sort of grant certain concessions back to the French to keep them happy. So in 1774, the Quebec Act gets signed. The effects of the Quebec Act are kind of threefold. So politically, the province of Quebec remains the same. The Canadiens were now authorized to join the council and the colonial administration thanks to the Test Act being replaced by the Quebec Act. Legislative Assembly, demanded by the British Party, was not created. So that didn't happen yet. Legal aspects. French civil law were now fully reestablished, and British criminal laws were still maintained. And religiously, people in the province of Quebec retained the right to the Catholic religion. Okay, so certain things that happen. I'll write them down for you. Okay, so there they are. So if you just want to be reminded of those. All right, and the last thing that the Quebec Act did was it actually gave back a lot of territory to the province of Quebec. So if you think back to the last map you saw during Royal Proclamation when Quebec had become very, very small, here's a look at what it looked like after the Quebec Act. It got much bigger. Okay, so there you have it. See, here is Royal Proclamation 1763, and then here's the Quebec Act 1774. So you can obviously see the big change, okay, in terms of territory. So let's just move those out of the way. Okay, so there were some big-time effects, though, right, as a result of the Quebec Act. One being that the vast majority of the Canadiens were pleased, obviously, with the Quebec Act because it gave them back their French civil law, gave them back their seigneurial system, gave them more territory to engage in the fur trade. It recognized the Catholic religion. So there's a lot of positives there. Unfortunately, the inhabitants of the 13 colonies considered the Quebec Act to be really a true provocation, meaning that they were trying to provoke something from them. So they were extremely offended that the territory had been granted back to Quebec and that they gained more territory. And so the Quebec Act was really one of the major strings that really took place right before the American Revolution happened. Okay, so there was a number of sort of things that happened after the Quebec Act gets signed, and really one of the things was that people living in the 13 colonies started to plan a siege against the British, all British possession in the British Empire, and so you began to see the 13 colonies gathering into Congress in a place called Philadelphia, where they discussed a strategy to sort of go after Great Britain. They actually appealed to the French-speaking Canadiens and actually asked them to join forces with them, but it actually failed to interest them. And so there was a number of armed confrontations that took place. There were a number of battles that occurred. And eventually what happens is on July 4th, 1776, you see the 13 colonies declare their independence, and they change their name to the United States of America. So an armed conflict occurs, and the American War of Independence takes place. In 1778, France and Spain begin helping the insurgents, and Great Britain loses the war. So in 1783, another Treaty of Paris ends up happening, and Great Britain and the United States of America end up separating. And so just something to keep in mind, 1776 is when the United States becomes its own nation. I'm just going to show you the map as a comparison, just so you can visually see it. Okay, so as you can now see, it's pretty clear. After the Treaty of Paris 1783, you now have the United States of America right there, right? And now you still have the province of Quebec. Rupert's Land is British-owned, as well as these islands here being British-owned. Okay, province of Quebec is also British-owned at this point, but it's considered a little bit different than the rest of British possession because of the fact that they had granted them, the ability to practice the Catholic faith and their own law and whatnot. But point being, the American Revolution did have a pretty significant impact because in this area right here, which was once the 13 colonies, now the United States of America, there was a group of people who did not want to join this new nation in 1776. They were actually a group of people who did not approve of the 13 colonies, and so they actually are a group that remained loyal to the monarch of Great Britain, and we'll talk about them next to finish off. So, many colonists, like I just said, remained loyal to Great Britain, and this was a group of people in the 13 colonies known as the Loyalists. So they didn't want to be part of the United States of America. They wanted to stay loyal to Britain, and so a bunch of them left the United States. About 100,000. Okay. About 100,000 of them emigrated. Emigrated, obviously, is the opposite of immigrating. Emigrated means to leave. So 100,000 of them left the United States of America. Nearly 50,000 of them went to British territories located north of the United States, mainly to Nova Scotia. But of the 50,000 that left, 7,000 arrived in Quebec. Okay, so 7,000 of that number ended up coming to Quebec, which was pretty significant when you have 7,000 English-speaking Protestants arriving into a place that is predominantly French-speaking and Catholic. So prior to the arrival of the Loyalists in Quebec, there were really only a few hundred British in the province of Quebec, but then the Loyalists raised the proportion of colonists of British origin. So these demographic changes had a significant impact on the province. The Loyalists found that the British institutions they were accustomed to, such as a legislative assembly and British civil laws, were actually absent in the province of Quebec. Therefore, when they joined the British merchants, they started to demand a constitutional act, which gets signed in 1791 to address their demands, and that is exactly where we picked up in our next unit, the demands and struggles. It starts with the Constitutional Act of 1791. And that is exactly where the videos pick up. So I hope you enjoyed today's video.
Thanks for watching video 3 on the Change of Empire unit. I hope it helped you out, and happy studying. Goodbye.